So we're doing this every Thursday evening and Saturday afternoon at 2 p.m. until the end of the month. And I want to thank the Adirondack Council for sponsoring this event. So I had many people ask me, how did you get someone as renowned as Juan to come to Paul Smith's? And the answer really is the Adirondacks and the Vic. And that's what brings so many people of all walks of life to this area. And the way I met Juan was I was working at the desk earlier in the summer, and I didn't know Juan before that, and he was looking at some of the items in our exhibit area, and I just walked over, and I think I'm just going to tell somebody about this fire tower Adelaide and how you figure out where fires were, or you did 100 years ago. And I started to do that, and then Juan started. Then I got out the phone that the observers had, and they had this portable phone, and I'm showing it to Juan, and then he started telling me all about the phone, the type of plastic it was, because this was from the 1930s, and it was the early first versions of plastic. And then he started explaining how the phone worked with connecting it to the telephone. I was like, wow. And then we walked over to the window, and I showed the older version of the phone, the original 100-year-old telephone that was in the fire tower. And he's telling me how the engine worked in there, and I was just really blown away. And we kind of spent the afternoon hanging out, looking out the window at birds, because Juan's wife was out birding. Juan was healing up at that point. And Juan's not the greatest birder in the world, and he will admit that. His wife is the main birder. So we sat there together and looked out at the feeder out the window and worked on his bird list. And Robin was on the ground, and checked that off as a bick-nosed thrush. And by the end of the day, we had an ivory-billed woodpecker. So yeah, maybe that's not a good joke anymore. Sorry about that. But anyway, it was a really wonderful conversation. We continued it again the next day, even though the bird list was exhausted. And at the end of that, I asked Juan if he would come back in the fall and visit with me again and visit with the greater campus community. And I'm so thankful that you did come back. So now I want to welcome Dr. Juan Perez-Mercader. Did I do okay?
That was great. My mother could not have said it better. That's my mother's family name. Perez is my father's. And my mother said I did all the work. So my father said no. Good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to visit the VIC and visit Paul Smith's college and be with you talking about what I do. And let me say to you a few things about myself very quick, so that you know who is the dude talking with you. So my name is Dad. I am originally from Spain. I was born near Seville in southwestern Spain. And I became a physicist. I am a physicist. I became a theoretical physicist. Then I went to Trinity College in Dublin. Then I came to the United States. I won a Fulbright scholarship from Ireland. I couldn't get it from Spain, so I got it from Ireland. So the Irish probably didn't like it, but that's called poaching. So, and then I came to the City College of New York. That's where I got my PhD, and then I did my postdocs and so on. And then I came back to Spain back in late 1983 to actually change my visa. I was getting a job at Los Alamos National Laboratory, and I had to change my visa. When I left Spain in the early 70s, it was a dictatorship. When I came back in 1983, the whole thing had changed in a beautiful way. A wonderful democracy where you could actually almost say what you thought, and so on and so forth, and I decided I would stay there. And I did stay there, and then later on, and then I became a permanent member of Spain's National Research Council, where I was a professor of a research professor, they call it. And then in the late 1980s, Los Alamos wanted me back as a consultant, and I started coming to both places, working in both places, Spain and the U.S. And so the U.S. became like my other country. Now Spain is my other country, but that's okay. It's a very nice thing. And then in the early 1990s, I was tired of working on superstrings, very mathematical descriptions of nature, high energy physics, the structure of the universe, particles, elementary particles, and so on. And after doing some contributions there, I was sick and tired because there were no experiments that you would. Can everybody hear me?
Not really.
Okay.
Not really.
Not really?
Without the mask.
Yeah. Yes.
Can you take your mask off?
I don't know.
Yes,
Yes.
absolutely.
I may.
Yes, please.
I tested negative yesterday. Okay.
Yeah.
So, well, day before yesterday. Yesterday they told me. I get tested every week. So then in the early 1990s, I decided that I would do something else. I did something else, and then I became enamored. I like nature a lot. It's one of the reasons why I came to the VIC a few years ago. We came, my wife and myself, and we loved the place, so we came here. So in the 1990s, I became enamored of asking the question, who ordered life? Why does life exist here? Nobody knows the answer to that to this date. So a friend of mine, a very good friend of myself, is a person senior to me, and myself, we started making all kinds of exercises in Los Alamos, exercises in the whiteboards, trying to provide a theory for life, the mathematics of something that would describe what life is, or at least what life is attributed with. I will describe all of this. If you have patience, I can describe carefully. If you don't have patience, I can describe very fast. But I adapt also. So then we started working on this, and people at NASA heard that my friend, who was at that time, he was in the President's Councils of Advisors in Science and Technology, and I were working on this, and then NASA, of course, knew my friend. They knew me just a little bit, but not very much. So then they offered us to start working on astrobiology, a new science that they were going to put together. Life as coming from outer space, or being a consequence of the dynamics that occurs in the universe. So be it as it may, we didn't do it with NASA. Eventually I said, I would like to make a center in Spain to do this. It's my country, blah, blah, blah. I felt I owed to the taxpayers. Not that I didn't pay my taxes, but I owed the taxpayers. My father was a postman, so I was graduated from university and all that, so I was very grateful to scholarships. I know I worked very hard, but I still was and I'm very grateful. So I started working on trying to understand why life exists on Earth and maybe elsewhere in the universe. And the first thing we noticed was that we only know one example of life on Earth. We do not know any other example of life. Therefore, we cannot compare the properties of life on Earth with the properties elsewhere. The comparison of phenomena in different circumstances is the key to what we call the scientific method. The scientific method is a method we use to understand nature and its behavior. For that, what we do is we observe a phenomenon, for example, the falling of a rock, and then you characterize the phenomenon. You say, this height, what is the speed it reaches down there? Oh, it depends on the height, and so on and so forth. And you characterize the phenomenon and provide a mathematical description. This is very important. You provide a mathematical description because what you want to do is to be able to, no matter what is your culture, no matter how you did the experiment, if you did the experiment right, it should fit a mathematical law. And that mathematical law, the mathematics is the same for everybody. So you can repeat the experiment and encapsulate somehow the essence of the phenomenon in some mathematical description. This is fundamental, and it's played an extraordinary role in the science of the 19th century, the 20th century, and it's playing an extraordinary role in science today through climate change. So this is very important, the scientific method. In biology, you only have one phenomenon, as I said, so what do you do? So you say, okay, maybe there is life in other places in the solar system. Maybe there is life in other places in the universe. And that would be places where we could go and check if there is life. How would you know that that is life? So you would need to actually define or describe life. You don't define it, you don't define gravity. You describe gravity, you describe life, you describe the phenomena. So we began working on that, and then I ended my 2 terms as director of the center that I founded in Spain, and I wanted to get the hell out of there and talk science, do my science that I put in back burner for 9 years actually. So some friends of mine knew that I was going to leave, and somebody told me, why don't you come and join us in Harvard? And I came, and I'm super happy. What am I doing in Harvard? In Harvard, what I'm doing, I don't have to teach. I do teach some courses to advanced undergraduates, together with other colleagues in the Origins of Life Initiative. And I have a laboratory with a number of people who changes between 6 and 14, plus 3 people who are there all the time, including myself. And what we do is we're trying to put together totally artificial systems that behave like life. We don't want to copy what life has done. Just like the Wright brothers didn't copy the motion of the wings of a bird. The Wright brothers didn't do like Icarus, who of course crashed because he had a wax in his wings, and anyway, so he was imitating nature, imitating verbatim nature. So the Wright brothers were smarter than the Wright brothers were very smart people, and they knew of Bernoulli's principle, which is a principle that describes how if you move air in a flat surface, the pressure here and the pressure underneath is the same. But if the surface is slightly curved and the air is moved this way, it is moving faster here than here. So if the molecules of air move faster here than here, there is a difference of pressure. And that is what makes planes fly. So you need to go ahead, move at a fast speed, then there will be this pressure differential, and the plane will fly. So you actually fly hanging from the wings. Okay? So this is not copying nature, but copying the functions of nature. So the question that I ask is, can you do that? And the answer is yes. So how do you do that? I'll explain that and give you some context and some information about how we do it. So I will talk about, I have here a little cheat sheet. It's the only cheat sheet I have. And I will talk about several things. I'll show you my cheat sheet. If I can find my mouse, I did. And today, I will talk a little bit about terran life. Now and then, I will describe very succinctly the properties of living systems. Then I will talk a little bit about the universe so that you can put it in context. Put this marvelous thing that we see with these changing colors in the foliage, put it in context of things that happen in nature. And nature is more than the Vic or other places fortunately in many places in the world. So we will talk a little bit about the universe to put it in context. Then I already spoke a little bit about the scientific method, but I will give you a couple of examples so that you can relate to it better than what I did say earlier. Then I will ask the question, are we alone? And talk a little bit about the search for life, very little, but I will. And talk about exoplanets. You see, this is an extremely important development in the history of science that has occurred in our lifetimes. In 1995, friends, we thought that we only had evidence for one planetary system, that is the solar system. This is 1995. The Russians, in the late 50s and 90s, late 50s and then in the 80s, they have described or written down a theory of how planets form. And that theory was led by somebody by name Safronov. It turned out that Safronov wrote some equations, and according to Safronov's equations, the universe should be pregnant with planetary systems. We, meaning humankind, launched the Hubble Space Telescope. At first it was myopic because somebody screwed up, okay? And then we are not idiots, so we fixed it, and then it was marvelous. Like, I suppose, like when you have a cataract operation. Somebody is threatening me with a cataract operation, so. But he said that it would take 10 years or so I feel better. But then we saw in the Orion Nebula, we saw something that was predicted by this Safronov. We saw something they call proplyds. If you want to Google it later, Proplyds. And they look like the cocoon of a silkworm, except that it is thousands of millions of miles large, and that's the beginning of a planetary system, according to Safronov and company, and many other people in the United States as well and in Europe. And then, in 1995, somebody from Switzerland, he got money to actually look at some using a telescope in South America and Chile. He got money to look at certain stars that might contain planetary systems according to Safronov's theory. And guess what? He discovered a new planet, a star with planets. How he discovered it and so on is a beautiful enterprise, but I cannot talk about it today. But what I want to say right now is that until 1995, we didn't have any evidence whatsoever of extrasolar planetary systems. Today, we have thousands of them, and we have many more thousands of planets which may harbor life. Some of them are even like the Earth, Terran planets, we call them. So I will talk a little bit about this and mention to you a couple of missions that NASA has going for this. And this, of course, means that, there may be life in these places. So it's a fantastic, in quotes, excuse to go look for life elsewhere. But we need to ask, how did these planets form? It turns out that the formation of planets must have been the same all over the place, but it depended on what the conditions, the local conditions were in the galaxy when they formed. So that means that some planets will be rocky, some planets will be gas giants, other planets will be icy worlds, and so on and so forth. Today we can classify them. And it turns out that there are many of these places which could be habitats for a chemical system that organizes itself as a living system. So this is why this is a very important point. Most people are not totally aware of this. This is a Galilean level discovery. It was it was awarded the Nobel Prize for this a couple of years ago, I think, to these two persons, and they really deserved this prize that year. So after that, we say, I will talk a little bit about how do you describe a living system? Can you write some equations? Like the Wright brothers knew how to use the Bernoulli effect equations. Can you write some equations for that, for living systems? And once you write the equations, can you actually make something in the laboratory that behaves like a living system? And if you were sober and not drink too much or smoke too much, and went to a microscope, looked at it, and saw it, you would say, it's a living system. And somebody, me, would tell you, no, it's a totally artificial living system. And that's what I will end up describing today. I know that I already ate up 20 minutes, but I do also see that you're attentive, okay? So, I will keep asking, okay? I have a tendency to be long-winded, but I also have a tendency to want to make myself super clear. And I also have a tendency to pay what I owe. And what I owe is service to you. And this is culture, and this is very important that you know why we do this. So I will describe very quickly making life in laboratory experiments and conclusions. So let's start with the beginning. Terran life. Life in our planet. So all of you can recognize life in our planet. You look at objects and you see, for example, Amanita muscaria, and you know that this is a living material. Or you look at this cottonwoods, I think they are cottonwoods, and you recognize them as living material. You look at poppies, you look at goats, elks, eagles, areas of coral and so on and so forth. And then you recognize these objects and you say, this is alive. So, this is life on Earth today. Life on Earth didn't start yesterday or last century. Life today, life in our planet is the result of the evolution of a very special chemistry, which we call biochemistry, the chemistry of life. All life today is based on several very important molecules. Two of them are hyper important. One of them is RNA, and the other one is DNA. Many people think that the first living systems already had RNA in them. But then the question is, and how the hell did the RNA get here? Who ordered RNA? And who ordered this organization that we call life? So the question goes back. I will talk more about that. But life, as it is the most extraordinary example of complexity we know. We don't know anything which is as complex as life. Our own brain is an expression of life. Extremely complex, different from complicated. It is also complicated, but it's different from complicated. And there is something very important. It's a treasure for us to preserve for future generations. Why? Because it gives us happiness. And we want the generations that comes after us to be as happy as we are, at least. It's our duty, and I think it's ingrained somewhere in our own DNA to do that. So this is very important for me and for my friend, the guy that I mentioned earlier, who was my senior. His name was Murray Gell-Mann. So it was very important for us to preserve it for future generations, and we did work along these lines also. That was at night, okay, and pro bono. So what is life? How do you get here? Is there life elsewhere? How do we preserve it? And what do we preserve of this life? If we understand how life works, then we will be able to preserve it. If we understand how life doesn't work, then we will be able to actually take measures to avoid that. Someone will say, the hell with it, okay? But most of us will say, let's preserve this beautiful gift. The only place where we see life is on planet Earth. And planet Earth, of course, contains a very important element or substance, which is water. Planet Earth is the only body in the solar system that in its surface contains liquid, gaseous, and solid water. Liquid water in life plays a very important role. The role it plays is equivalent to the role of an electrical cable moving electrons. In a cable, you want to transmit the signal, say, from the computer to the projector, and you want to transmit the signal as faithfully as possible. So you need a very good conductor. Hence, we use copper. Water is a very good conductor for information in molecules, because water doesn't affect many molecules. So it doesn't change those, whatever information is contained in those molecules, and therefore it will preserve any information that you build into molecules. In fact, that is something one of the results of this project that I am doing is that we have invented a chemical computer. We have invented a chemical computer based on what we've learned about life. Okay, if you're interested, there is a patent in the US Patent Office under our name. So water plays a very important role, similar to the role that copper, not the only role, but similar to the role that copper does for carrying information. And water exists, especially in liquid form, exists abundantly in the planet. So what we need to know and to understand is how we became the planet that we are. Here you are. I made sure that it was focused on the United States. Okay, I have another one which is focused elsewhere. So, and this is the gas, the gas, the solid, and the liquid. So, do we need to look for places that are liquid, that contain liquid water in the surface? Well, we'll see. Let's keep on going. How did we get here? This transparency represents the history of the universe. You may, some of you, if you are inclined to do mathematics, will see that this is 1, 2, 3, and 4 widths. And if you wrap it, it makes the shape of the World Trade Center. This transparency was put together by whoever put it together as a little tribute to the people in the World Trade Center, these columns, okay? They're in a few museums. And in this transparency, if you are here at the top floor, and you come down, you go from the Big Bang to the formation of our planetary system. And then the way to read it is to go up here. This is the sun in a particular wavelength, exaggerated in size, reduced in size very sharply. This is Jupiter, this is Mercury, or Venus, I think. And this is the Earth at the beginning. And then life formed here when we live. And then it went into the seas, or stayed in the seas, and then eventually came out on the land. And here we are, human beings, thinking about ourselves, thinking about our place in the universe, and worrying about being the stewards of biodiversity, trying to preserve it, and thinking about where the hell do we come from. And this is a little icon for a Mars mission that was launched in the 1970s. So let me go in a little bit of detail here. This is the Big Bang. The Big Bang occurred 13.8, essentially, billion years ago. So that's how old the universe is today, 18.7, 18.8 billion years old. When it started, it was a cloud, a mixture of elementary particles, no organization, extremely hot. And then the time began to tick, tick, tock. So time began there in the evolution of matter. As matter was evolving, it was very hot, it was expanding. As it expanded, it created a space. So space is the result of the evolution of matter, and so is time. We do know today that both space and time are curved. This is important, but not at this point, right here. So it was very hot. By the first 3 minutes, some of the most important elements were formed. The water that is here contains hydrogen. The hydrogen atoms that you see here, most of them were formed at that time. So this is a really old fossil. But only the hydrogen. So hydrogen and helium were formed in the first 3 minutes, and lithium also, in your batteries. Okay? So then it started expanding very quickly, and as it expanded, it cooled. As it cooled, it began to make condensates of material, like big clouds, like super clusters of galaxies. Then it kept expanding, and matter, because of the force of gravity, rearranged and the nuclear force rearranged itself from galaxies, stars in those galaxies, then the stars. This is a going down in dimension. You will see in the next transparencies. And then the universe generated different types of stars. And in some places, like the place where the Earth was 4.567 billion years ago, it's easy to remember the age of the Earth, 4, 5, 6, 7, just count, billion years. It's a great trick for children. Okay? So there was dust that was coming from the stars, and the dust and gas formed and reorganized themselves in the form of something like a fried egg, okay? with things turning around, and then the planets were formed, and then eventually means in maybe 10 million years, all this cloud was cleared, and here you have our planets and our planetary system. So from here to here, it took about 9 billion years. The water that is here contains oxygen. That oxygen was formed here. Now, these three panels here, or this, which looks like a single panel, actually are from the beginning of the Earth, about 4.567 billion years ago, all the way to about 3.5 billion years ago, 3.2, 3.5 billion years ago, then all the way up to today. It's easy to remember and to not lose track of things if we proceed with the following example. Let me describe to you in a very graphical way what is here, to give you a sense of the scales we're talking about. Imagine that I was a very strong man and I had wide shoulders. The shoulders were as wide as my arms. Okay? So this is, if I am like this is 1/3 of the distance between here and here. So from here, from my left armpit to the tip of this finger is 1/3 of that. 1/3 of 13.8, 13.7, let's say 13.5, is 4,500. So between here and here there is 4.5 billion years. The oxygen that is there was formed right here. Then the matter that was created there was reorganized for another 4.5 billion years. And then the Earth was generated here. And then the Earth kept evolving, and here we are today. If I were to take a quarter, I don't have a quarter, but if I were to take a quarter and look at the edge of the quarter with its striations there, which were invented by Newton, if we were to go there and I did this on my nail, I would take out a little bit of the nail. That is enough to erase mankind for 100 times in the history of the universe. I hope I am not blowing your mind too much. But that is the proportions of things we are dealing with. That is what the scales that we're dealing with. So this is extraordinary. So life in our planet started here, as I said, about 3.8 billion years ago. And what happened is the following. What we think happened is the following. And I will describe this very quickly, and this and that, and then I will talk about something here, and then I will go here. So today we see eukaryotes like us, multicellular systems, or systems that have living systems that have a nucleus in the cell. We have bacteria, which are systems which are simpler, they are unicellular, and they don't have a nucleus where the information is kept. There are many of those bacteria in our gut, in the air, in many places. And there is archaea, which is something which is not really an eukaryote, and it's not really bacteria, and they're sort of a mystery, not really a mystery, but they contain a lot of puzzles for biologists. We do know that here, we do know today by looking at the genomes of plants, all kinds of living things, and the genomes of archaea and the genome of bacteria. We look at them and we can trace them back in time. It's called phylogenetics. So we can trace them back in time, and they all converge into a common point. The information that they have in their genomes converge into a common point right here, which we call Luca. You know, like Lucas the Evangelist, that name, okay, last, which stands for last universal common ancestor. So there is a last universal common ancestor for eukaryotes, for bacteria, and for archaea. They all come from the same place. We do know, and I will show you a picture now, and I almost brought a sample for you to handle it, but I didn't know how many people there might be, so I decided not to bring it, okay? But you will see a picture. We do know that whatever it was here in Luca, which was about 3.4, 3.3, 3.5 billion years ago, okay? So that was about here. Okay? Already was very complex. Contains DNA, contains RNA, contains proteins, contains sugars, because we trace back the genomes we see to this. And how do we do that? With a lot of effort and great techniques that people have invented and discovered. So this was already quite complicated. So you go ahead and scratch your head a little bit and say, could there be something simpler than that? It is a natural thing that we see that complex things don't come out of nowhere. They are the result of something else, which is simpler. And usually we say, or we believe, that the complexity of the surface is the reflection of a very deep simplicity. In other words, things are very simple inside themselves. And things, because of the relationships between materials and so on, become complicated as things evolve. So that is a rule of thumb of everything we see. So perhaps there was an ancestor here, because there is also, and then that ancestor probably was here about 3.8 to 4.2 billion years ago. So these, we call them protocells. Nobody has seen anything remaining of a protocell. We just think that they must have been around, because otherwise we do not understand how we got here. And there are people who are very dedicated to try to build systems like this, and they find it is extremely complex and very difficult to accommodate the formation of those systems with the science we know today in the primitive Earth. So then we are beginning to think in terms of protocells. So this is something which we should bear in mind. A minute ago, I mentioned that there was here a common ancestor. How do they look like? Well, I didn't tease you, but I did mention that I was going to be bringing something, which is a fossil of that. A fossil, this is an arrow, but it's the same size as an American quarter. So this that you see here is a piece of this stone. This stone looks like you look at a Chester sofa, and they have buttons like that. Okay, so these are called stromatolites. Something like mattress rocks. And this is, you would walk, for example, in Australia, which is where this is from, you would walk as I'm walking here, and then this is what you see. And if you dropped the quarter, then you have the quarter. So now imagine we have a saw, and we're going to cut here a little cut, and look at it. So if we got a cut, we will cut here on the dice, on this platform. You actually cut and from underneath, and then you pull this out. You understand? That is precisely what you're seeing. And let's look at it. So if you look at it, you see that there's these formations here. You discover that there are whitish looking things. You put them in a microscope, you study, well, in an electronic microscope, and you study. This you see with your eye, with your bare eye. And if we had it in the room, we would be passing it around. And you would touch it, and many people have touched it, but it's important that people know these things. And you would, these objects here look like the shells. You look at them in microscopy, and they look like shells of something. But what is really a telltale is that these black areas here are the degenerated with time, the degraded with time, remainders of lipids that there were in the surface of these objects. And those lipids are compatible with the lipids that we see today in bacteria. So this, which is from Australia, and this particular one, this one is 3.4 billion years old, is one of the best examples of life as it was 3.4 billion years ago. It was already quite developed. So this is something we have to come up to grips with, because we see that life, if we look at life today and you look at bacterium, this is Escherichia coli. You have a lot of them in your colon, okay, in your gut. And this here, between here and here, is about 2.5 microns. A micron is a thousandth of a millimeter or a millionth of a meter. A meter is 3 feet. So it's very, very small. And if you look at this in more detail, you discover that there are proteins and objects there which arrange themselves in this way to actually power the flagella. This is very close to the turbine of a jet plane. So the molecules move here. This is the DNA. The molecules move here, and they actually impinge upon the blades there, which are pieces of protein. And then this rotates, and as it rotates, it moves a polysaccharide, a flagellum, which propels. It's seen here, propels the bacterium. Okay, so this is pretty sophisticated. Things like this, my friend, already existed 3.5 billion years ago. So, as you can see, there is a huge gulf. And that is illustrated in this picture, where I have made sure that I wrote the word coevolution. And I have made sure that I wrote the word coevolution because the evolution of life is evolution that takes place, changes that take place in the planet, the environment in which it is, and in the living systems. So it's not the evolution of the planet, period. It's the evolution of the planet and the living system itself. And that is a very important point to bear in mind. It's important for many reasons, not only for climate change, which of course is a fundamental reason, but it's important for us ourselves. So the coevolution of Earth, the environment, and life, from its very big, from the birth of the planet, to look at, we believe took place like this: 4.5 billion years ago, the Earth formed. Then it was very hot, and then eventually it condensed, and it condensed with a water vapor that actually became condensed as liquid water on the surface. There were lots of volcanoes and so on. There was an extended period of time, which in my opinion is from here to here, where there was evolution of chemistry, prebiotic chemistry, chemistry before the chemistry of biochemistry, and then eventually some people believe that it was a pre-RNA world. I believe in this. And then there was an RNA world that was formed 3.8 billion years ago or so. And then this eventually, 200 million years later, gave rise to the first DNA protein life, like the ones that I showed to you. And then the last universal common ancestor is 3.6 to present, evolution. So the Protocell Era, which is eventually what bridges the separation between simplicity and the complexity of life, probably was around for about 400 million years. And it's totally powered by chemistry. So life, in spite of the complexity that I was talking about, is it's even more interesting because all life that we know is made, has limitless diversity, and it's made from a limited number of basic components. It's just all the same components being mixed, and you get bacteria and you get us. You get Picasso. You get George Washington. You get all these people. Okay, same elements, same materials that you use for making a humble little bacterium or a grasshopper. Isn't that amazing? It's mind-boggling to me, at least. So the important thing here is that the assembly of these components is an assembly which is controlled by chemical reactions, by chemical computers. I just mentioned to you something about a chemical computer. That's why we had to build a chemical computer, because we wanted to learn how this happens. So, but in addition to these basic features which are shared by all life, they all share a very small number of properties, actually 4 basic properties. All living systems control information with chemistry, their own information. With that information, the living system is capable of seeing molecules in the environment that it scavenges from the environment and makes parts that will actually assemble with this control of this information. Those parts will be assembled and make the parts for a child. A child meaning a descendant, a daughter. Okay? That is so you have the information, you have the metabolism, which is the making of those parts. You have the self-reproduction, which is the making of daughters who have daughters. And evolution, which is adapting in a way in which the living system actually is capable of surviving a wide range of circumstances. Okay? So those are the 4 properties, and those 4 properties are shared by everybody except viruses. You see that viruses are not here in anything that I've said so far, and they will not be in the talk at all. But I need to mention them. Viruses have something which is very important. They cannot self-replicate or self-reproduce. Viruses, as we all know, need a host, hence our masks. Okay? Need a host to self-replicate. And why do they need to do that? Well, I'm going to say something which I feel a little bit weird saying it with you, but I will say it. Some people, like myself, believe, not many people have this discussed this very clearly, but we believe that life is a trick invented by nature to actually mix 2 types of chemical materials. Materials which are minerals and materials which are non-minerals or volatiles that came from the formation of the solar system or any planetary system. I'll say more about that. This idea is not my idea. It occurred to me, but then as a scientist you research and you say, oh shoot, somebody was talking about this. And I found somebody who was talking about this and was referring to another somebody who is the first one who studied, a guy whose name was Vernadsky. He's the first person who started talking about this. And I think that there is something to that, but I will not talk much more about that today. Okay? So this is what characterizes life, all life, these properties. So they all use chemistry, they use the same chemistry, and the properties are only 4 properties. So we can ask the following question. Is life a result of chemistry operating on materials and the environment? Yes. Chemistry is same here as elsewhere in the universe. We understand stars, we understand molecular clouds, we understand planetary systems by making the assumption that what we see there is what we see here. Then matter is the same here as elsewhere in the universe. Laws of physics are the same here as elsewhere in the universe. Otherwise, we will not be able to send a satellite to Mercury, for example. Tomorrow is Friday? Yes. Tomorrow there will be a satellite that carries a thing that I helped design to Mercury. Okay? Even Earth doesn't know that. I just keep it quiet. So we will not be able to launch things and send things to other places if the laws of physics were not the same. And essentially, evolution of the universe, we believe, generated all the forms of matter here on the Earth and elsewhere. So is life a consequence of the evolution of the universe? People like myself and many other people think that that is the case. So how do you describe the evolution of the universe? Well, very quickly, because this is about life, but we need to put it in context. You can think of Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton saw, this is probably a myth, saw the apples fall. And then he timed how long it took and so on and so forth. And then he realized that it was dependent on the amount of matter, the velocity and so on. It was dependent on the amount of matter that was contained there. So he said matter probably is the same in the universe he knew then. This is the 17th century. So he said, well, I'm going to imagine that there is a universal force that keeps things revolving and and they move with an acceleration and they revolve. And then he imagined that the planets that have been described so beautifully by Kepler and others, actually, when they evolved, these planets were actually falling just like this falls to the center of the solar system where they were. So with this, he wrote the law of universal gravitation. With the law of universal gravitation and Einstein on the way, we are able to write a set of equations, which is here. I don't know if you can see. A set of equations which are here, which when we solve them, you are going to see a numerical solution here. They actually produce a certain pattern. And this, what you see here, is the result of looking at the sky in southern New Mexico and looking at the galaxies there and putting each of these dots here or blobs here with a color like a greenish or reddish is a galaxy. And they are there is a mathematical artifact to put together, like enclosed in a veil, all the galaxies which are moving at the same speed. So, can we predict this? Well, if you take Newton's theory and then you put into it the notion of a very simple space-time, which is what Einstein imagined. Einstein imagined that the space-time is uniform and isotropic, meaning that it is the same everywhere at large scales, obviously not here, and it doesn't matter in which direction you look, it will look the same. So he wrote these equations, and when you put those equations in a computer and you give it a little kick, here is what happens. You see that contrary to what you would expect, that everything will collapse to the center, it actually organizes in strings of this type. And therefore the theory, with these simple equations, predicts the evolution of the universe as we see it today. And this is one of the greatest accomplishments of the beginning of the 2000s, that we've been able to understand this in extraordinary detail. And there are people who do computations in observatories where they study this, and what comes out is the notion that the universe started with a Big Bang. Okay? Let me see if I can. The universe started with a Big Bang here. It started creating time and space. It expanded, and as it expanded, generated galaxies and so on. So we can actually predict and know the origin of galaxies, how galaxies are formed. And if you go out tonight, sorry, am I okay? Okay. If you go out tonight and you look at the sky, if it is clear as it was last night we saw the most beautiful sky we have seen, my wife and I had seen for a long, long time, and maybe ever. We're staying in Saranac Lake, the upper Saranac Lake, and we went there, and yesterday was a new moon, so there was no light. And you could look at the sky. We live in Arlington, Cambridge, same thing, Massachusetts, okay? So we see the Northern Cross, we see, Cassiopeia and a number of things. But yesterday it was all illuminated. It was even reflecting on the waters of the lake. The Pleiades was reflecting on the waters of the lake. It was, wow, extraordinary. We felt so little, which we are. We felt so little. But what I wanted to say is that we also saw the Milky Way. Okay? So we look at the Milky Way that you can look at tonight, and you're luckier than we are. You are in a place which is really protected for this, so you could see it. But if you look at the Milky Way, what are you seeing? Well, let me take you on a little trip. Okay, so here is a little bit of Lagavulin, which is a good whiskey there for everybody. Okay, and we'll take a little trip. So we take the Lagavulin, and this is the way, if you were to be on a trip, this is the way our galaxy would look like. If you were way out, the light from here to here would take about 1 million years or 500,000 years to cross, okay? Light goes at 300,000 kilometers per second, and if it went around the Earth, if it could move around the Earth like this, it would turn around the Earth 8 times, I think it is, in 1 second. So that is fast, okay? So let's imagine that we are in here and that we have drunk our lagavulin, okay, beautifully, and we're going to come towards here. So this is the way, we know that this is the way our galaxy looks because of many studies. In our galaxy, there are 10 billion stars, many of which are like the sun. And if you go here and make yourself little, this is what the sun is. So imagine yourself reduced in size, thanks to Lagavulin. We go in here, and we are in there. And we look sideways on Saranac Lake. What do you see? All this light, all these stars, is what you see. But you see them from the side. That's why you see the Milky Way. The Milky Way is your galaxy with all the stars seen from inside the galaxy. Isn't that cool? Okay, I'm sure that the next time you look at the Milky Way, it's not going to look the same. But sorry to have destroyed the myth. But it's fantastic. It's extraordinary. Many areas in this galaxy contain, as I explained a little bit ago, contain planetary systems that we are discovering now. So imagine how many planetary systems there can be in here. So we have launched, human beings have launched missions to actually look for those planetary systems. And the guiding principle is that in a galaxy like this, in the material that is between the stars, in here, there will be some chemistry that takes place. And in fact, we have launched missions where we have measured the chemicals that there are in the space between the stars. It's called the interstellar medium. Not a very difficult name to remember, okay? And we looked with the spectrometers, and we find a huge variety of chemicals. For example, we find hydrogen sulfide, so somebody's cooking eggs there, and not even methanol. We find hydrogen cyanide, sulfur dioxide, formaldehyde, deuterium cyanide, water in large quantities, sulfur dioxide, so many things, more water lines and so on. So the interstellar medium contains about 400, we have identified about 400 large molecules which are not biomolecules, but they could give rise to biomolecules. For example, formaldehyde, I don't know where the hell I saw it, but right here. Formaldehyde can react with itself in the presence of calcium and generate many things, including sugars and so on and so forth. So this we see in the interstellar medium. And in the interstellar medium, matter rearranges itself. This is Safronov's equations. Okay? Whatever the equations indicate, it's just to show to you that I know how to write equations with my computer. Okay? So look at this. This is like a supernova which is going to go off. And this is a cloud of material which contains the chemicals that I mentioned earlier and maybe some minerals, although the minerals will probably be made in the supernova. Notice I said the minerals will probably be made in the supernova, and then these are like volatiles, like the ones we saw earlier. So let's see the supernova exploding. So this is not a real picture. This is somebody who is good at Adobe, okay, and he's also good at the science. And she directed him in a nice way. So the supernova goes off, compresses the material here, and the material here relaxes and forms this. This is what you can see in the Orion Nebula today, I think. Can you see the Orion Nebula in the sky tonight? If you can, yeah, we are close to December, yes. So if you look at the Orion Nebula in the sword of Orion, you can see this with your good binoculars. You can actually see the nebula. You will not see the details of this, but this is what was discovered when the Hubble Space Telescope was fixed in 1992, 93. Okay, 92 actually. So this is important because this is what is formed. Let's look at one of these in more detail. If you look at one of these in more detail, the author did some calculations, and she found out that the materials were organized like this. Now, the density, these are called, oops, excuse me, I keep pushing the wrong button. Damn it. It's a new version, and it's giving me all kinds of trouble. So in this one you can also see it. So you can see that there are some areas in which materials condensate, and they move, and they wipe clean the area, and they form planets by accreting pebbles. Something that we have seen over the last 2 or 3 months. We have evidence that this happens in extrasolar planets, and you see what in the end happens. The star in the center and the planets rotating around it. Are you with me? So this is what is going on there, is that we are mixing the materials that were in the interstellar medium and the minerals, and therefore that is a component, an important component for the making of a planetary planets, like in our solar system, and for making the components, the atmospheres and so on inside the planets. We are looking, thanks to NASA, we are looking at swaths of the sky, looking for many planetary systems. This is your galaxy, as we saw earlier with Lagavulin. Okay, this is so, and we are looking at many planetary systems in some areas here. It's a mission which is called Kepler. Okay, and it's producing a huge number of data. And there are people like ourselves. It's a paper which has about 12 or 13 authors. I am one of them. We have found out that the planets that we're finding are gas planets, like for example Jupiter's, water worlds, like Pluto and company, Neptune and company, and rocky planets like us. So if you are very much into mathematics, you would understand that this pattern here is actually what Safronov's equations predict. Okay, so we have equations that describe the formation of planetary systems. And then we say, could these planetary systems, could these planets, like Saturn-like planets, Jupiter-like planets, could they contain life? We don't know. But we are looking, and then we are looking, for example, near Saturn. We look at one of its moons, which is called Enceladus, which has a diameter of 500 kilometers. 500 kilometers is about 300 miles. That's the diameter of this one. It's an icy world. And it's covered, the surface is covered with icy water. And Cassini, a NASA mission, took some pictures of the surface. And if you look at the surface, this is what it looks like in more detail. You see that it's bombarded by things, and you see that there's ice which is fracturing there. And you see something which will blow your mind, I think, when you look at it from far away. And what you see is that out of the ice there are geysers that project water from the inside of Enceladus into outer space. It's as if they were, I mean, if you're totally high, you would say, they're suspending it. Okay. Of course, that's not the case. But it's as if it was suspending it. And then we have instruments on board Hubble Space Telescope that we all pay for. Okay. And we look at what's in there. And see what you see, my friends. You see that there's methane, that there's water vapor, that there are simple organics, that there is carbon monoxide, that there are complex organics, and that there is carbon dioxide in this material. So it's complex chemistry going on there in a very mundane, so to speak, body in the solar system. And we even have theories of how that actually is working in detail, and we think that we will be able to find some form of advanced chemistry there. And there is missions which are being right now studied to actually go to Enceladus. There are other places like, for example, Titan in the solar system, a satellite of Saturn also, which contains a huge amount of methane, and there are lakes of methane in there. And this is, for example, one of these lakes, for example, is smaller than Saranac Lake, probably Osgood Pond's size. Okay, and they are liquid methane. It's extremely cold. Okay, but we think that there may be some self-organization of living things there, of chemistry leading to living things there. And of course, there is Mars. In Mars, we have a fantastic idea of what Mars looks like. This is Mars compared to the Earth. Mars doesn't have so many clouds. This is the guy, I said the guy who did this, who probably had too much lagavulin and got carried away with Adobe Photoshop and put too many clouds, okay? Doesn't have so many clouds. But we believe, we have evidence to think that Mars had a huge ocean in its northern part, ocean of liquid water, about 3.5 billion years ago. When the Earth was beginning to produce LUCA, there was a lot of liquid water on the surface of Mars. So where did the water go? Today, thanks to international collaboration, we look at Mars and we study Mars with neutrons, and we see that the interior of Mars contains areas, this one's in red, which have liquid water in there. Excuse me, I did say liquid, but I should not have said liquid. It contains water in there. And the water probably is in liquid form, in caves in there. Okay? So we are sending missions to actually drill and see if we find water there. We have sent this mission, which is Mars Science Laboratory. With Mars Science Laboratory, we see that there is sedimentary rocks. Today we scratched the surface of Mars, just a little tiny bit, and you get right away ice, water ice, not only carbonic acid. And then if you drill a hole, Mars, this is about 2 inches, what you're going to see next, in diameter. If you drill a hole, then you see that the outer part of the surface is reddish, the inner part is very grayish. That means that the outer part is oxidized and the inner part is reduced chemically. That means that there is energy differences that could power the formation of life on Mars. So we're looking like crazy to see if we can actually bring samples of Mars to the Earth. All of this leads us to say, so there are many places where the conditions are such that life could have existed. Let's look into a little bit more detail to what life is. And then if you look into a little bit more detail, as I mentioned earlier, you see that life contains order. As you see here, you see adaptations, like in these seahorses in coral. You see that life responds to the environment, as this dragonfly. We see that life reproduces. We see that life grows and develops, processes energy, regulates, and so on and so forth. All of those properties can be expressed or can be incorporated into these 4 properties. So just like Bernoulli produced his equations and the Wright brothers made made planes using those equations, can you take these properties and put them into a set of equations? And the answer is yes. And the answer is yes. And you can put those equations in a computer, and when you put those equations in a computer and you solve the equations, this is what you see. So imagine that that thing was put, and these were some objects which are generated by some chemistry. You see that they behave like bacteria. They are replicating and so on as they eat. So you can actually write down those equations, and with those equations, you can actually, if you understand how to read the equations, you get an idea or what is the materials that you need to put together to make something that has all those four properties that I mentioned. And the first thing you need to do is make, like in a bacteria, you make a capsule where you enclose the parts of the living system. So this is the first thing you need to do. For this, we use polymers. And we use polymers which are easily found in the laboratory, and you make molecules which are long but all the same size. And these molecules have the property that when you put them in water, the molecules begin like this, and this is one of the molecules like the ones you found in the interstellar medium, and you add some monomers here, they begin to polymerize, which means that these molecules begin to add here. This part likes water, this part hates water. This is hydrophilic, this is hydrophobic, this is water. And in water, what will happen is what this animation tells you. When you do the polymerization with blue light, you begin to add these molecules, and they keep adding the molecules. These objects cannot stay in water without forming structures like these materials. Here is the reason why. You start with this polymer, then you begin to add more monomer, which doesn't like water, and it comes to a point where they organize themselves, they make spheres, then they make something like worms, and then they make vesicles. These vesicles are of the order of 5 microns, about the size of a bacterium. And this is very important because this provides a capsule in which to make the polymers, in which to make all the chemical reactions that a system requires in order to carry information, to do metabolism, this is part of metabolism, and to self-replicate. And this is what they look like in the material. They start like this, and then eventually they get pockets inside. The pockets tend to organize themselves, and they make a hollow material there with molecules inside. And then these molecules will keep evolving, and they will keep reacting and generating things, generating materials. To do these experiments, you don't need a huge apparatus, but I will just describe the results for you. And what you do get is this. So this is a system that was generated in the laboratory. It doesn't contain any biochemistry. It contains some organic chemistry, but not biochemistry, carbon chemistry, not biochemistry. And there is light that was chosen to direct the chemistry. So what you see here is not a computer simulation. This is a micrograph in a computer. And this is a fluorescence microscopy. So what you see, look at this black thing, these blackish things, and this, which is very bright. They are like, imagine, like a very small, meaning 2 or 3 microns in diameter blob. And then let's look at this in particular. This guy here was one of these earlier. So this likes to go where there is light. The center of the light is here. And what I would like for you to look at is see how this fellow keeps growing and tumbling his way to the light, because in the light he's more effective. And notice several things. Notice also that more come here. Notice what he will do. He will collapse and grow again, and do it a few times. Each time that it does, it squirts out molecules as if they were in a fern where you put out spores, and then from the spores there's more ferns that grow, or with mushrooms, for example. These objects do the same, exactly the same, but it's molecules that squirt out, and out of those molecules new objects come. So this is a completely artificial form of a very simple form of life. Okay, so this is what we are doing, or what we do in the lab, and then sometimes we are making, or we are doing experiments also, where we take a couple of populations of these, and we give an advantage to one of the populations. We take one which contains, for example, a metal that reacts more effectively and makes the vesicles in a faster way. So we make them, say this one with one metal, say zinc for this one, and ruthenium for this one. And we put them, we make them, and then we put them together. They actually compete, as I will show to you, in a way which mimics directly the way in which Darwin's finches competed. Darwin's finches in the Galapagos Islands, there was a population of various types of finches, and they were pretty good at eating wheat. I think it was wheat. And when the weather was dry, the wheat was hard. So the ones that survived were the finches with the bigger beaks. And then the finches with smaller beaks declined. They all were competing for the same resource, the wheat. So those who were able to consume the resource prospered. The ones which couldn't disappeared. Okay, that's called, if you look at Darwin's theory of evolution book, The Origin of Species, there is a chapter which is called the struggle for existence. And in the struggle for existence, what happens is that when there is one resource that is shared by many species, there is one species only that is capable, with time, is capable of surviving. It's called, this process is called the competition exclusion principle, and it's a consequence of the struggle for existence. So we do this with we put this with ruthenium and this with zinc in the same vial, and we shine light. And here is what happens, just like with Paramecia, which is how this was shown. They actually, one disappears and the other one dominates when you put them together. Okay, so we are seeing that, and what we have is a system which is the simplest you can imagine. The chemistry that I showed to you is the simplest that human being, which is capable of reading the equations, is actually to put together. It's like if you take coffee and you make coffee with the Chemex. The filter, the coffee, and the water, and it's coffee. You can make different types of coffee and so on, and then you begin to get variety. Or if you want to be technological, then this is what you do. You make a coffee machine with all bells and whistles, and then you make the cover of the New Yorker in November 2015. So this is the cells, what they need to survive in special conditions. This is, of course, the simplest possible materials that we know. So we have a way of generating from equations. We can generate materials that actually form this type of structures that evolve into this type of vesicles, like a cell. And then, of course, this is the same movie that I showed you earlier, and I'm not going to punish you with another version of the movie. The important point is that we are making big strides to generate life in a laboratory. Generating life in a laboratory, which is nothing like life as we know, but it is teaching us how life works. It is a model to imitate life, just like others imitated birds in the function of flight without flapping the wings. We're doing the same thing without DNA. That's essentially what it is. We're doing the simplest possible that one can build. So that tells us several things, and one of the first things it tells us is that there must be many places in the universe where this type of chemistry, not the one we have here, but chemistry that gives rise to these behaviors, is present, and therefore there must be life in many places. And I will end with the conclusions and what did we learn today. So we learned, I'll read it to you, that life is an extremely complex physical-chemical phenomenon. It's nothing special. Of course it is special, but it's not special in the sense that it is physics and chemistry. And many of its chemical and molecular components were made outside the Earth in the interstellar medium, and they were deposited here when the planet was formed. We have also learned that from 1995 to date, we have discovered thousands of planetary systems besides the solar system, which was the only planetary system we knew till then. Many of the planets this planetary system contains, seem to be rocky planets, which means planets with rocks, maybe organics, and maybe there is something that will combine them both. Okay? And what took place in our planet with chemistry and physics, which gave rise to generate a form of life that evolved into the life we know around 3.6 million years ago, billion, I put here, no, 3,600 million years ago, yes, it's right, okay, years ago, may have occurred in many other places in the universe, presumably preceded by simpler stages. So simpler stages where the chemistry gave rise to systems that eventually were able to adapt very well to the environment in which they were, and they invented something like biochemistry. Are there any vestiges of life in other bodies of the solar system? We don't know yet, but Mars is a good place to look for them, but not the only place. And we are studying the habitability, and results may soon be in, particularly for Mars. For Mars, we're beginning to see that there are organic chemicals there, and we are very excited about it. Okay? I don't participate in those missions anymore, but I had something to do with what's there. But I get very excited, but I get more excited with the experiments that we do in the lab, okay? Things change. But this is very important, and it's not my work. So we are studying habitability, and results may soon be in. Life, like other physical chemical phenomena, can be represented using equations. It would have been very surprising if it could not be. The thing is that people didn't even try. And we tried, and we tried in a very simple way, the simplest possible way. And we came up with a set of 3 equations that actually represent living systems with all those properties. And these are representing equations is one of the 3 pillars of the scientific method. The scientific method contains a mathematical representation, because mathematics, no matter when you do it or how you do it, will always give you the same results, unless you're crazy. Okay? And that's what you want of an experiment. Same conditions, same result. We do the scientific method requires experiments, and in modern times they also contain computer simulations, where instead of using equations which are derived from first principles, people use algorithms, and it's a part of the new computers of the new scientific method. And finally, this opened the door to make life ex novo, which means from completely from scratch, by suggesting details of the chemistry necessary for life. So we're doing this in our laboratory and are on the path to experiment. I forgot to put here space, to experimental success. So this tells us that we may be able to understand how to live with life in the planet and share the little blue marble that we live in. Thank you very much for your attention, patience, and generosity with your time. Thank you. Thank you. I hope I didn't make you fall asleep.
You got time? Any questions?
The last simulation that you showed us with your, showing us the experimental stuff you're doing in your lab, what was the time frame on that?
On the simulation,
Yeah,
you mean the one, the microscope picture?
yes.
That was not a simulation, it was an experiment.
Okay, so
The time frame, the time lapse on that was minutes,
minutes.
like
okay.
14 or 15 minutes.
Okay. And is that, I don't know how many of these you've done, but is that sort of an average length of time?
We are doing things now, maybe today. They were in my lab doing things which take about 20 hours to divide. Okay, so That's the Escherichia takes 20 minutes to develop, and I come to my gut. So these take longer. But the important thing is that they came out from a soup which was totally homogeneous. And the chemistry was chosen in such a way that the chemistry would self-organize in a particular form by generating these molecules, which have a part which is hydrophilic and another part which is hydrophobic, in water. So they cannot stay by themselves in water unless if you increase the concentration of the molecules. So the molecules will reorganize themselves in water and make these structures. These structures begin to grow because there is chemistry that is making the molecules longer. But as they begin to grow, it comes to a point where there is something which I'm sure you know about, which is osmotic pressure. And there is osmotic pressure differences between the outside and the inside. And that makes the system grow up to a point and then collapse. And when it collapses, there are defects in the surface of the vesicle through which there is seeds for these molecules, which eventually became hydrophilic. There are seeds that actually go in the liquid. And those seeds, because of the light and the food that is present, go ahead and make children. You can actually see a population, how it grows, and it grows in a way which people who are ecologists and so on in the room will immediately recognize as a Coevolution type of population. So they grow like this, sigmoid. So the answer to your question is, it's minutes, it could be hours, and I'm sure we can make it days. And then I wanted to illustrate a little bit the answer to the question by saying that then these guys begin to reorganize among themselves as a population, not as individuals. So that's the answer. You're welcome. Any more questions?
So one question is your experiment that's headed to Mercury.
Experiment?
You said something about having something of yours on a mission that's headed to Mercury.
Oh, yes.
What is it?
Oh, it's a spectrometer.
What is it going to measure?
It's going to measure UV light and gamma rays coming from the surface of Mercury. It's in Bepi, Colombo. It arrives there tomorrow. I'm sorry, honey. Too many things going on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Another question that occurred to me.
The idea is to see if there is any on the surface of Mercury is very hot. It's quite close to the sun, but it is believed, because of signals that other people have seen, it is believed that there is water somewhere in Mercury. So, is there water there? So, we started building this in we started conceiving this in 1996. And it only flew a couple of years ago. These are very long range. I mean, this space exploration is very difficult, and it's very difficult on people in the academic world, because you don't get papers. Hence, you don't get tenure. You don't get positions. You don't get tenure, and it's really bad. Of course, departments of Earth and Planetary Sciences try to accommodate that, but it's impossible. It's impossible to accommodate because people don't produce so much. Okay? So, but there are people who are very devoted, and for 20 years or 25 years, there is a group of people from England, from Germany, from Italy, from Spain, from Japan, and a few people in the United States who've put together this mission. Bepi Colombo, I'm sure that it is in the newspapers. Okay, I just got an email today reminding me. So, more questions? It's anything you feel like asking. Don't be shy. Don't be shy. Just ask.
when you talk about the amazing progress that's been made since the mid-90s, are there any, has anybody written a book? So
Yes.
that someone like me, that's like the book that's telling us what we've achieved in just that time.
Yes, I can send you the link.
I would love
I can send you the title of the book. There are many books. The guy who discovered these planets, who premiered this instrumentation, these instruments, is a person whose name is Michel Mayor. He's in Switzerland. And there was another person, Marcy, who was in the United States, but I will not mention him. When you go to the internet, you will understand why. So it's unjust to him, but it's just to others that I don't. So Michel and Marcy put together a spectrometer, and then they saw this epiphany of planetary systems that they found where they expected to find them. It's very interesting to see how they found them. Imagine this is the star for the planetary system, and this is a planet rotating around the star. When the planet rotates around the star, it will wobble the star. The Earth, when it rotates around the sun, wobbles the sun. And if you look far away and you have a spectrometer which is really sensitive, then you will see the light of the sun changing a little bit. And then you would see that as not only that, but you will also see that as the planet goes in front of the star, the intensity of the light from the star whoop, goes down a bit. A planet, if you look at the Earth and compare it with the sun, this is the sun and this is the Earth, what it looks like. So imagine something going in front of this and darkening the sun. That can be measured. And this is what these people found. And then many missions have happened, and my boss in Harvard, his name is Dimitar Sasselov, Sasselov. He is the director of the Origins of Life Initiative. I am a faculty member of this initiative. My boss there, he has a book written on it. Okay, so you could look for that. That's a few years old. He will tell you that too. So, but I can find new books, more recent books that describe all this epic. It is epical and it's very fundamental. It is the equivalent of Galileo, which I think is extraordinary. Aren't we lucky that we live at the time we're living? With so many things. I suppose it always has been like that, but this is the only time I've lived. So, more questions or comments, or please?
What are your views on non-human intelligence here on Earth? Do you have any?
On Earth?
Yes.
Well, I do have views about intelligence. I will say it's very difficult to find. Okay? But I will be less cynical and give you an answer. I think intelligence is not just something that human beings possess. Ants, fishes, all kinds of living things, bacteria, they seem to be acting with a principle that guides them, which is not obvious. The principle is not obvious. Just like intelligence. You remember things, you act, you do things, you perform facts, you perform actions, not facts, you perform actions according to a plan which exists in your head with logic, hopefully. It seems to be that many systems, from aspen trees, to ants, to birds, and so on, actually use similar guidance. By guidance, I don't mean guidance to move, guidance on how to move, how to proceed. I would call that intelligence. This is an evolution in me. Okay, in 2002, I would have said, nuts, that's who you are, me, for thinking this. Not anymore. Why? Because I've learned more. And I have developed not only as a person, but also as a scientist. And I begin to see that signs of intelligence are everywhere. Everywhere. So what do I think about intelligence beyond the Earth? The universe must be, the same word I used earlier, and I looked at you when I used the word, the universe must be pregnant with intelligence.
Right.
So we're nothing special. We're just a wonderful thing. No kidding, okay, it's very important, but we're just the reflection and the consequence of something which is way beyond us. Way beyond us. And it is, I think, it is a blessing for us that we are able to appreciate it. And the people who are here, obviously, I mean, you didn't throw yet any rotten eggs or tomatoes at me, okay? So I hope you don't do it. But the people who are here, we all are persons who work and do our jobs and so on, but we're interested in this. And why are we interested in this? Because we want to know who we are. And this is, I'm getting chills, okay? And this is, in my legs too, as we call here. So this is a fundamental issue. The question of why, and this I don't have any real thoughts about, but I am going along the notion of intelligence. Why, this is what I don't know how to answer. Why, what's in our DNA, what's in our, meaning termites, birds, bacteria, ourselves, and elephants, okay, everything. What is in our DNA that impels us to understand and discover? Why do we need to understand? Why some people are not happy if we don't understand? I am one of those, okay? I admit ignorance my own ignorance in many things, of course, but I always try to understand, and I always keep asking why. I think that's a sign of intelligence, or more than a sign, is a harbinger of intelligence. Wanting to understand, wanting to know what are we doing here. And I think that is a hallmark of us. I don't believe that ants are asking questions about the origin of the universe. They may be, but man, I mean, they probably communicate with formic acid and it gives us allergy, and therefore we don't know what is going on, okay? But why are we doing that? I know not. Why do we produce extraordinary things like Shakespeare or Cervantes, by the way, who died on the same day, literally, or Picasso, or the Wright brothers, or the people who are doing the fundamental work with COVID? Where does all of this reside? And it is very important that there are institutions of knowledge, of learning, that actually archive this material and propagate it.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Yes?
So back to the exoplanets, detecting from the wobble. How many, so that's just luck of us being on the same plane to see the axis. So how many do you think we miss? Because
I understand. So, yes, that's a very good question. So, there is the Earth, where you are. This is the star, and the planet is doing this now. You wouldn't see that wobble. And you wouldn't see any wobble in the other direction, and you wouldn't see anything that is darkened either. So, but if you are like this, in the same ecliptical path, then you would see everything. So what he's asking is how many are not in that path? I don't know, but there is an answer. I do know that there is an answer because I heard somebody give the answer, okay? But I don't know the actual answer. I know the argument for the answer. But I don't know if it is we're missing 60%, we're missing 90%. I think it is in the 90s%. If you're very interested in knowing the answer, give a Scott your address, and I will send you an email. I'll ask somebody who can properly describe this for you and give you the answer. But we're missing a lot. So it is fully pregnant with planets. It's amazing. It's fantastic. And here we think we are so important. I don't get it, but. Any more questions? So one question which I will ask myself. What do you do with this? Okay? Well, let's go back to the telephone. Let's go back to the radio. The result of the reason why we have radios, we have telephones, and we have communications, and we understand the communications, is because in the 19th century there was an extraordinary scientist whose name was James Clerk Maxwell, who was studying the equations that describe electricity and magnetism. So you have two charges, two electrical charges, and Coulomb described a law which is called Coulomb's law that says that if you took two charges and they are of the same sign, they will repel, and if they are of different sign, they will attract. And both attraction and repulsion would go like 1 divided by the distance raised to the square. That was a mathematical statement based on what people were measuring with charges in the laboratory. In a different type of experiments, a French, and I think two French physicists discovered something which is called the Biot-Savart law, which says that if you have a cable and you move in the cable, you move some current, it will generate a magnetic field. And that has a description which is 1 divided by r squared, but a little bit more complicated. So the mathematics of this are the same mathematics, especially if you have the same, the attractive charge, the same mathematics that Newton had considered about around 1687 or 1647 in the 17th century. So the mathematics of this was known. The mathematics of this was also known, but it was not well understood. But this had a 1 over r squared. This had a 1 over r squared. To a very distinguished Scotsman, James Clerk Maxwell, that was an indication that there were things in common, mathematically. The fact that it was moving charges, it was clear to him how to put that in writing. So he said this phenomena and that phenomena must be two manifestations of the same equations, the same phenomena. This is electric phenomena, this is magnetic phenomena. So you can guess that I'm going to say electromagnetic phenomena. Okay? So he put together these 4 differential equations, which are called Maxwell's equations, and he put it together at the time when we had the Civil War here, 1862. Okay? I just caught myself saying we had the Civil War here. So these equations are 4 equations that describe electric and magnetic fields. These equations, if you play some tricks with it, mathematical tricks with it, which are straightforward, you detect that they contain waves. Electromagnetic waves, they're called. And you could calculate the velocity of the waves. And it turned out that the velocity of the waves that came out in terms of the electric permeability of the vacuum and the magnetic permeability of the vacuum, 1 divided by the square root of the product, is the velocity. And what came out was very similar to what it was, a huge velocity, which had not been measured by them, the velocity of light. So he said, Maxwell said, I'm describing light as electromagnetic waves. But he said, how do you produce light with these electromagnetic waves? A few years later, about 15 years later, or 25 years later, Heinrich Hertz took his equations and made electromagnetic waves in the laboratory. He took two charges, a Rumford coil, and established the current, and then there were waves, electrical waves that were propagated that he was able to sort of detect. These waves are the originator of radio waves. Radios are built using these equations. And the guy who did that was Guglielmo Marconi, 15 years later, or 10 years later. Marconi was the genius that saw how to make these waves and how to use them to communicate. So he made the radio, and here we are. Okay? So we have equations that describe very simple systems, saving all the differences. Those are the equivalent of this. The properties of biology of living systems in general are described, are something like these equations, sort of, in this comparison. This is Maxwell's equations, which unify these forces. The equations that you were asking about earlier, those equations actually have solutions which are like living things. So how do you build that? That's what we are doing in the laboratory now. We're trying to perform, with a lot of hindsight, of course, we're trying to perform this step. Now, what will the radio be? Well, biomaterials, chemicals which actually will help us, chemicals which will actually destroy us, because somebody will do it. Okay, and chemicals that will help us make materials in many places, including in our own bodies, to help ourselves. Okay, so there is a huge number of things. Another thing, which is why I am funded by who I am funded, one of the reasons, okay, is a company which is an oil company, but they know that they need to change. So when they heard that I was generating new things, they asked, can you make something that will generate some sort of hydrogen? And of course, you can generate systems like this, which are engineered to actually break water with the light of the sun, do hydrolysis, and send the hydrogen in one direction and the oxygen in another direction. Chemistry is quite efficient. It's more efficient, and because it occurs with molecules, it's more efficient than things that require more detail, like, for example, electronics. Not that chemistry doesn't require details. Okay? But so, who knows what the future will bring? But there will be many applications, and people will discover those applications, and then they will discover a better way of doing it, and so on and so forth. So, anyways, any more questions? So I think you said something about having something outside.
Yes, there's some stuff out there. There's some beverages out. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.